Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about conflict. So we've talked about irony, we've talked about symbolism, we've talked about setting, we've talked about theme, right? We've talked about all these different types of literary analysis you can do. So conflict is going to be the basis for our research paper. Again, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking notes as we go through this. And you're going to want to make sure that you know these specific terms, because I don't want you just to be able to say, hey, that's a conflict. I want you to be able to say, that's a person versus nature conflict, right? Or that's a person versus person conflict. So make sure you're getting this down. So let me move my little face. So what is conflict? So we want to kind of zoom out as always and kind of look at what does it kind of encompass. So the events that make up a short story, or really any story, but we've been looking at short stories, involve some sort of conflict or struggle between opposing forces, right? So sometimes this can be like two people. This can sometimes be a person in a situation, right? We can sort of see how these conflicts develop in a pattern throughout the course of a story, right? We can see how character A makes a decision that ends up causing a conflict with character B and C, right? Or how they end up creating a conflict for society or the people around them, right? So we can see how these different patterns affect one another. Conflict is often the driving force between what a character chooses to do, right? Characters are always kind of making choices, they're reacting, they're acting, and it's generally because of some sort of conflict, either within themselves or with other people, right? And you've probably heard of internal conflict and external conflict. And we're going to get a little bit more specific than that. And we're going to look at a bunch of terms that specifically look at different types of conflict. I want you to remember that you can analyze conflict and really anything, right, by looking at the actions as well as the words of a character. So dialogue is always something you can use in your analysis as support. I'm going to pull this down here. So generally, when I do this, I ask you guys to think of examples sort of in the media, sort of that you might kind of know, but we're also going to be looking at examples through Frankenstein. So the first conflict that we're going to look at is a person versus person conflict. And when you write about this, you'll say person versus person conflict involving character A and character B, right? So this is a really easy conflict to identify, and I think one of the most common ones we see in movies. But this is where we have a character kind of struggling against another character, right? They're opposing each other through actions or words. Like always, it can be seen through narration, dialogue, or what isn't even explicitly stated. So an example of what we've seen, like in a movie of person versus person, is we have Harry Potter versus Voldemort, right? They're kind of opposing forces. They stand for different things, and we can kind of see how they're very much driving the plot because of their opposition. We also see this in Frankenstein quite a lot, right? And that's one of the big things I'm going to want you to be doing is applying these conflicts to Frankenstein. You want to make sure that you're looking at like specific aspects of person versus person conflicts, right? You don't want to just say Victor Frankenstein versus the creature, right? That's huge. Maybe you want to say person versus person, the creature versus Victor as his father figure, right? All right, so then that takes us to person versus self. So this is kind of that internal conflict. This is where a character can struggle against their conscience, maybe choices that they're going to make or have to make or have made. They're going to have these internal issues that affect their actions and interactions with other characters. So I'm thinking of in The Lord of the Rings, where Boromir really wants to bring the ring back to Gondor to save his people, right? And he has this internal struggle with like, do I try and take the ring? Do I not? I want to be a good guy. What do I do, right? We can also see this person versus self conflict in Frankenstein, for an example that we might all understand, when Victor is wondering and struggling with whether or not to create a female creature, right? He's kind of struggling with his own conscience, what might end up occurring, right? So that takes us to person versus nature. So person versus nature, this can be nature itself as an obstacle for a character, right? So this could be an obstacle such as a tsunami or an earthquake, right? And I think that there have been entire movies devoted to natural occurrences, kind of creating person versus nature conflicts. But it could also be like nature, like the circle of life, like life and death. So if we look at Frankenstein, we have a really good person versus nature conflict when we look at Victor's experience with death, right? So at the very start of our novel, Victor's mother dies, and he ends up having this really intense reaction to death, right? Of course, because it's an awful thing. But because of this person versus nature conflict, the beginning of the conflict is his mother dying. But what ends up happening, right, in the end of this conflict is he ends up playing God and creating life, right? So that would be a good example of a person versus nature conflict in our text. This then brings us to person versus society. So this is where a character's beliefs and ideas don't really align with the belief systems of the society or culture, right? So this could look like prejudice. This could look like unfair laws. This could look like old traditions. So it could be, any kind of story where someone is othered or on the outskirts, right? If we look at Frozen, right? Elsa is kind of othered because she is different, right, than everyone else, right? She has this crazy magic ability, and she doesn't know how to control it, and it harmed people, right? So they're prejudiced against her. We have this sort of person versus society conflict when we look at our creature, right? He very much wants to be a part of humanity, right? He wants to be a part of the human world, yet he is absolutely othered, right? Every time he tries to get close to human beings or be a part of human beings or act like a good human, he's rejected. So he has this kind of person versus society conflict. And if you were to look at that, you'd want to trace it through all of his sort of interactions with humankind until he's like, I'm done, right? Which there's a very specific place in the text where he's like, not doing this anymore. I hate humans, right? So that brings us to person versus technology. So this is where a character is threatened or fighting against some sort of technology. So we're talking robots, machines, space travel. So a good example of this is the movie Ex Machina. A lot of sci-fi actually would work as a great example of this. So in our text, we can think about sort of Victor's science as like person versus technology a little bit, right? Like he's sort of trying to overcome what technology can do in order to create life, right? We can also think about person versus technology as far as technology can be anything, right? It could be like my cell phone, but it's also fire, right? So you also have like when the creature first encounters fire and the creature is trying to utilize this technology to survive, right? That's also person versus technology conflict. So the last one is person versus fate or the supernatural. So a character could be struggling against fate itself, right? So it could be a predestined outcome, but they continue to kind of fight against it, but they're unable to, right? So we have those movies, Final Destination, right? Where like they like are supposed to die, but they don't, and then like death just keeps coming for them. I think about in our text how one of the person versus fates that I could see is, like Victor fighting against his fate of the creation of the creature catching up with him, right? He's like running from this, but it's his fate to kind of face the music for what he did. We also have characters in conflict with supernatural forces, kind of like under this umbrella. So zombies, vampires. You can look at, the Twilight series or Interview with the Vampire. But you can also look at our text, and you could argue that it is about the supernatural. Okay. So when you're analyzing a conflict, there's a couple things I want you to remember. You want to always make sure you discuss whether or not the conflict is resolved and how it's resolved. So resolution is not always super positive. So we always like to think like, okay, and they all lived happily ever after, like conflict resolved. The conflict could be like, the resolution could be like, and they died, right? Or, and they were all killed, or, and he was just super depressed, right? It's not always positive. You want to make sure that you're discussing the conflicts in depth to show not just that it exists, but like why it exists, right? So how does it kind of drive the story? Why is it significant in the story itself, but also to the development of the characters that it kind of is conflict for. So this is where we get to like the so what, right? In analysis, we talk about not what happened, right? We don't care about summary, not what happened, but why it happened. Why is this important? Why do we want to look at this specific conflict? You always want to make sure you can find quotes that kind of support your conflicts, right? Those are always our supports. We don't want to just say, hey, there's this conflict. We want to say, here's this conflict. Here's the quote that shows where the conflict is, and let me talk about it, right? Finally, everything kind of has a beginning, middle, and end, and that's true for conflict, right? We want to look at the start of the conflict. We want to look at kind of how it impacts the story and other characters, and then what that resolution is, right? So I want you to think about that for all your conflicts. And start kind of brainstorming which conflicts really stood out to you in the text, which ones do you really want to look at, and how can you connect them to issues that you still see today. Okay?